So today's webinar is about impact management for nonprofits. And just to get it started, I'll share a quote that I think really captures the purpose of this webinar, and it's also one of my favorites. Intentions are great, but impact is better. So really it's about turning those brilliant intentions that I know all of us have into real and sustained impact. Before we get started, I'll just tell you a little bit more about myself. My name is Maggie Dubyk, and I currently sit as the chair on the board of directors for an organization called SEED. SEED focuses on providing students with experiential learning opportunities with really the goal of building stronger and more sustainable communities. We have a base in both Montreal, Canada, as well as a small city, Gulu, in Uganda. I also work for a software company called Kila, which is a platform designed to provide nonprofits with intelligent tools to manage donors, mobilize volunteers, and fundraise. So between the two, I'm pretty much headfirst in everything nonprofit. My interest in impact management really came from working in the sector for over about 6 years now. I've worked predominantly with grassroots organizations focused on programs for women, immigrants and refugees, literacy, environmental sustainability, homelessness, you name it. I found myself asking the question a lot of the times, these programs seem really great, but are we actually making a difference? What I found was that most organizations had a really hard time answering this question. So I really made it my mission to discover how to make this question a bit easier to answer. Through a lot of research, interviews with experts, and personal experience, I developed an impact management journey that can support your organization in measuring and reporting on impacts. Please do keep in mind this is really not meant to be like a one-size-fits-all approach. It's more about presenting you with a series of tools for impact management that can be utilized to track your impact. So as we move through the webinar, feel free to share your thoughts and experiences related to impact management so we can also learn from each other, because there's a lot of different approaches to this. Lastly, I just want to give a big shout out to the experts in this sector, Ruben Baija, Najib Kassam, Toko Noloma, and Carol Wick for sharing your knowledge with me and letting me ask you a bunch of questions. All right, so let's get started. Where are we headed? First, we're going to look at why nonprofits should measure impact. Second, we'll look at what the impact management journey looks like. Third, we'll explore how to create a vision and mission. Then we'll look into building out a logic model for your organization. Next, we'll jump into how to develop a data management strategy. Then the fun part, building out key performance indicators so you can start tracking your progress and impact. Then we'll look at when to measure impact. We'll also look into how KPIs can transform impact reporting. And we'll end with a case study that reflects a personal experience of mine to just really bring everything together. So it's really a packed agenda, so we'll just go ahead and jump right in. All right, so why measure impact? Let's first take a look at why organizations don't measure impact. Now, as I go through these, see if your organization can relate to any of them. One is capacity. This is one of the #1 reasons why nonprofits shy away from measuring impact. Most organizations don't invest in impact measurement because of the lack of time and resources, as well as not quite understanding how to measure impact. We all know how it feels to be overwhelmed and say to ourselves, we'll save that for another day. Believe me, I've been there. Second is accountability. Impact measurements tell a story. If your impact measurements aren't looking so great, you have to start asking yourselves a lot of questions and be open to changing things up. This level of accountability is not always comforting and is another one of the central reasons an impact measurement ends up on the back burner. Lastly is deniability. The combination of lack of capacity and accountability can position your organization into a state of deniability. This is where the impact that your organization has is assumed, but without measurements to back it up. As you might imagine, this can lead to major gaps in impact. So now let's take a look at why we should measure impact. It contributes to increased accountability and transparency to stakeholders. It can motivate your stakeholders. They all want to see they're making a difference, right? Better use of resources, as you'll know what's working and what isn't. It makes impact reporting so much easier. You avoid mission drift, as measurements force you to stay on track towards your goals. You avoid impact washing, as you're working away from impact based on assumption. And consistent learning, as you have to analyze, reflect, and pivot. And most importantly, you're creating real and sustained impact. Now we'll head to the impact management journey. The impact management journey is really about outlining the preliminary steps that are going to be required so you can start measuring your impact. Now we're going to go into each of these components in a bit more detail. This is just to give you an idea of where we're headed. We first need to develop a vision and mission and a logic model to outline your organization's goals and programs. We'll then move into creating measurements and managing data. And lastly, putting those measures to work and developing compelling impact reports. All right, so let's get started. Vision and mission. The purpose of your vision and mission is to communicate the problem your organization is addressing and how you intend to contribute to a solution. Essentially, it tells stakeholders why your organization exists. As a starting point, you can ask yourself the following questions. If you already have a vision and mission, reflect on these questions as well. Ask yourself the following. What is the overarching problem your organization is aiming to address? Think about what's causing the problem and if there are any existing solutions to that problem. What are the long-term changes you hope to see as a result of your programming? How does your organization intend to contribute to the solution to the problem? Who are your beneficiaries? With these questions in mind, let's dive a little bit deeper into creating a vision and mission. Your vision is meant to reflect the hopes and ambitions for the future. So think about what the world would look like if your organization achieved maximum influence. So don't be afraid to think big here. Here's an example. Alleviate gender equality through economic opportunities for women. This is obviously not something one organization can do solely on their own. So think of it as the overarching goal your organization hopes to be a part of. Your mission, on the other hand, communicates how your organization supports your vision. This is where you want to scale down your vision into a more tangible goal. For example, promote gender equality by increasing women's employment opportunities through skill development, networking opportunities, and strategic partnerships. As you can see, this is a more specific goal that trickles into the larger problem that the organization intends to address. All right, so we'll keep moving here and we'll head to building out a logic model. First things first, what is a logic model? A logic model is a methodology for program planning and evaluation that's commonly used in the nonprofit and government sector. The most common logic model type is a theory of change, which many of you may have already heard of, or some of you might already have. But don't worry, even if you already have a theory of change, this is still going to be really useful for you. Why do you need a logic model? Well, essentially, it's the who, what, why, how, and when of your organization. As you'll soon see, it's going to act as a roadmap to your intended impact. Lastly, what is a logic model made up of? It's generally made up of 5 central components, and we'll walk through each of them. Outcomes, programs, activities, inputs, and outputs. So let's take a look at each of these components in more detail. Outcomes, what are they? They're the short, intermediate, and long-term change that you expect to occur after your programming has taken place. Be really careful in thinking that outcomes are the direct result of your programming. Because outcomes are meant to be measured over a longer period of time, like 1+ years, you have to keep in mind that other factors may have contributed to the change that you're seeing that lie outside of the scope of your programming. For example, if 2 years after an employment program, none of the participants are getting jobs, but there's also a global pandemic. This is something to consider, right? This is why it's helpful to think of outcomes as a result that your program has contributed to, rather than thinking of outcomes as a direct result of your programming. You also don't want to have too many outcomes or you'll start to overwhelm your goals. You want to keep your outcomes simple and broad. You might find that you only end up with like 1 or 2 outcomes, and that's actually okay. Creating outcomes is really a balance of being broad enough that it encompasses your goals, but focused enough that it's realistic. In short, the purpose of outcomes is to set goals that guide your organization towards your mission, develop projects that are relevant to your goals, and provide a tool for communicating impact. Let's take a look at a few examples. You have long-term outcomes, which are the larger scale social and environmental changes you expect to see about 3 or more years post-programming. For example, increased financial independence. Then you have intermediate outcomes, which are the changes you expect to be about 2 to 3 years post-program. For example, increased income due to sustained employment amongst participants. And then you have your short-term outcomes, which reflect the more immediate changes you expect to see as a result of your programming. So think like 1 year or so after the program. For example, participants employed 1 year post-program. So if you look at these examples, you can start to see how your short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes feed into each other. How your outcomes relate to each other must be evidence-based and include hypotheses of how one outcome leads to another. For example, let's say participants employed 1 year post-program, your short term, is an indicator that they will have increased income, intermediate outcome, which in theory should lead to increased financial independence, your long-term outcome. If your assumptions about how your outcomes relate to each other is not evidence-based, your outcomes will lose credibility and you'll risk drifting away from understanding your organization's actual contribution. All right, so let's move on to the next component in our logic model, programs. What are programs? I know it sounds pretty simple, but I just really wanted to highlight the difference between programs and projects as it'll become useful later on. Programs are larger in scale and they encompass a collection of projects and activities. On the other hand, projects themselves are smaller in scale and they're focused on specific tasks. So when your organization is developing a program, you should be able to answer the following questions. Is it in line with your vision and mission? If so, how? Be able to make that connection to avoid mission drift. Does it address the overarching problem your organization aims to address? Does it contribute to your short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes, and how? What will beneficiaries gain from this program? Think of selling this program to your beneficiaries. Would it be enticing? Would they buy into this program? Lastly, what condition would your beneficiaries be in without this program? This will make sure that your program is actually addressing an existing problem. So let's take a look at an example. If one of your outcomes is participants employed 1 year post-program, your programs might include an employment skill building course and a networking conference. Okay, so now we'll just move on to the next component, activities. Activities are specific project tasks or actions that support the success of your programs. So this one's pretty straightforward. For example, if a program is employment skill building course, the activities might include application building workshop, interview workshop, employment skills training. Okay, so now we'll move on to inputs. Don't worry, there's only about 2 components left and then we'll pull everything together. So inputs are resources needed to conduct your activities. Now, this is not meant to be an entire budget breakdown of what you need. The purpose is really to ensure that you're aware of and have access to the resources required to carry out your activities. For example, if an activity is an application workshop, the inputs might include $4,000 in funding, 6 workshop facilitators, and workshop materials. Okay, so we'll move on to our last component, outputs. Outputs reflect the immediate deliverables of your projects and activities. For example, services delivered, number of participants, resources distributed, things like that. The purpose of outputs is to measure progress towards your project goals, not your overarching larger scale program goals, but the smaller scale project goals. One of the keys here is to keep your outputs relevant by making sure they reflect your intended outcomes. Be able to answer the question, how does the success of this output contribute to our short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes? So everything has to be connected in a sense. For example, if one of your activities is application building workshop, an output might be applications converted to interview invitations. More interview invitations means we are one step closer to participant employment, which is our short-term outcome. So see how they start to connect a little bit? Don't worry, I promise this will make much more sense as we go through. So now that we've made it through all 5 components of a logic model, we'll take a look at what a logic model looks like in action. All right, so let's work through this logic model example. You can see that each component we went through has its own column. We'll start with the mission at the top. promote gender equality in Northern Uganda by generating employment opportunities for women through skill development, networking opportunities, and strategic partnerships. Whether you decide to add a mission to your logic model is really up to you and your organization. I found it can just be helpful, so it's always there for reference. Then you have programs, employment skill building course and networks conference. Then you have activities. For the employment skills course, we have application workshop, interview workshop, and employment skills training workshop. For the networking conference, we have a conference panel and a networking hour. For inputs, we have things like workshop space, funding, facilitators, things like that. Outputs, for employment skill building, we are looking for applicants converted to interview invites and job placements related to newly acquired skills. Outputs for employment skill building, we are looking at participant engagement and job opportunities acquired through the event. Lastly, for outcomes, we have short-term, number of participants who completed the program and participants employed 1 year post-program. Intermediate is increased income and sustained employment, and long-term financial independence. Now, the way you organize your logic model is really up to your organization, and it's really not meant to be a one-size-fits-all. You can see this model starts with programs, and then it looks at activities, inputs, and outputs, and ends with like all-encompassing outcomes. So it sort of moves from left to right. So depending on the way your programs are designed, your logic model might look a little bit different. Really, the important part is that you have all the components, and then how you organize it, you can get creative. So I'm just going to show you a few different examples of logic models, just so you can get an idea of how varied they can be in organization and design. You can see that they are all really different with components, shapes, and colors, but they do generally consist of those 5 main components we work through. And just as a heads up, we'll be sending out an impact management guide, and it'll have a blank template you can start with and start filling things in. If you already have a logic model, feel free to revisit it and reflect back on some of the recommendations we just talked about. All right, so now that we have our logic model, let's look at building out a data management strategy. The purpose of a data management strategy is to ensure your team has the resources necessary for developing and sustaining an impact measurement system. There's really no point in taking the time to create indicators if no one's held accountable for collecting, monitoring, and analyzing them, right? Note, you may need to make adjustments to your strategy once you build out your KPIs, which is definitely okay. This strategy is just really more meant to give you an idea of your team's resources so you can make realistic decisions about how, what, and when to measure. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. The first step is designing a task strategy. This means identifying who on your team will be responsible for each task required in an impact measurement system. A few tasks to keep in mind: who's creating your KPIs, who's collecting the data, who's monitoring and analyzing your KPIs, and who's reporting on your KPIs. Second is developing a timeline. Determine how often you'll be collecting, monitoring, and analyzing, and reporting on your KPIs. A few points to consider: the time period you're collecting data. Is it 6 months? Is it a year, 5 years, indefinitely? The frequency you'll monitor and analyze your KPIs. Is it weekly, monthly, quarterly? And the frequency of reporting on your measures. Is it quarterly, annually? The third step is to determine the methods your organization will use for data collection. Is there existing data you can work with, or will your organization really have to start from scratch? Just as a heads up, a few methods for data collection are stakeholder surveys, observations, existing public data, or internal tracking. Lastly, your organization is going to need to determine a database to store your KPIs. We'll go into this in more detail in a bit. All right, so at this point you might be thinking, all this chat about KPIs and data, well, what on earth do we measure? So now we're going to go to the fun part, which is developing your key performance indicators, or KPIs for short. So what exactly are key performance indicators? KPIs are data measurements that are intended to measure progress toward an intended result. KPIs will support you in tracking your progress toward your project and program goals, identify what areas of your projects and programs are or are not working, making data-informed decisions throughout the project cycle, and communicating your outputs and outcomes to stakeholders. Now, there are a few different types of KPIs we'll look at today that are all relatively common in the nonprofit sector. We'll look at outcome, output, risk, and SROI KPIs. As we go through each type, keep in mind that the type of indicators your stakeholders might be interested in. This is going to be really important when it comes to impact reporting, as you want to shape your reporting around what stakeholders want to see, right? And if you're not sure which information your stakeholders are interested in, don't be shy, really ask them. They might have some good input for you. Okay, so let's dive into each of these KPI types and work through a few examples. Outcome KPIs are indicators that your organization has been successful in contributing to your short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Remember, these are indicators of outcomes that your organization has contributed to. These are not meant to reflect the direct deliverables of your programs. Outcomes are probably going to be your best bet for tracking the longer-term impact of your program as they show change over longer periods of time. Think of outcomes as a marathon, not a sprint. Generally, you'll want to measure your outcome KPIs on a year-plus basis, as we talked about before. Anything below a year might not be an accurate depiction of your contribution. As we all know, it can really take a long time to see change on a larger scale. So let's take a look at a few examples that demonstrate how we can create KPIs for our outcomes. Note that I did aim to keep these examples relatively simple and straightforward, as this is more about understanding the concepts here than having intricate examples. So just keep that in mind. So let's say our short-term outcome is participants employed 1 year post-program. Then perhaps one of your KPIs for this outcome might be number of participants employed 1 year post-program. This one's pretty straightforward. Let's say one of your intermediate outcomes is increased income due to sustained employment. Then perhaps one of your KPIs might be looking at the rate of income amongst participants. See how these KPIs start to help you measure your outcomes? Last example, let's say one of your long-term outcomes is increased financial independence. Then perhaps one of your KPIs could be reduced dependency on spousal income. In this example, we're looking at measures that indicate financial independence. But again, this would need to be like a research-based assumption. So as far as collecting data goes for your outcomes, if your programs are smaller in scope, like in a small community, you can collect your own outcome data through like stakeholder surveys, for example. But if your programs are much larger in scale, you may need to rely on secondary data like public or government data or even local research to help you collect that information. All right, so now we'll move on to output KPIs. Output KPIs are numerical data measurements that show the immediate deliverables of your projects. They're meant to tell you that you're on track to meeting your project goals. And the idea here is if you're meeting your project goals or your outputs, then you're on track to meeting your intended outcomes. Really try to ingrain it in your brain. The success of your outcomes relies on the success of your outputs, so they're equally as important. For example, if a project output is applications converted to interview invitations, your KPIs might include the number of applications submitted per participant, number of applicants invited for an interview, and a ratio KPI, number of applicants converted to interview invitations. Ratio KPIs are really, really informative as they can communicate the relationship between two measures. For example, if we just measured the number of applicants and number of interview invites, it wouldn't really tell us much at a glance. So it's really helpful to see like the percentage of applicants being invited for an interview. It's easier to process data this way, so that's just a tip. All right, so let's move to risk KPIs. Risk KPIs might be the least fun, quote unquote, but they're absolutely essential to track. They reflect both the short and long-term consequences of your programming. This is important so you're not just tracking the positive results, You're also keeping a really close eye on if your programming is causing any potential harm or problems. This is going to require a bit of preliminary research so you can hypothesize what the potential risks are. You'll then be in a better position to build out KPIs to track this risk. For example, if one of your outcomes is increased income due to sustained employment, and preliminary research shows a correlation between women attaining income and domestic violence, you may want to develop a KPI that tracks domestic violence reported by participants. If you start to see this measure increase, you know you need to start thinking about a mitigation strategy. So the purpose here is really to catch those consequences as they begin to happen, rather than noticing years later or not noticing at all. These KPIs will also give you insights on increasing your impact because you'll discover roadblocks or barriers to like your intended outcomes that you may have not otherwise known were there. So the last KPI type we're going to look at is SROI. SROI is short for social return on investment. To keep it simple, SROI indicators are used to identify how effectively an organization uses its resources to create social, economic, and environmental value. Note that SROI is not essential for every nonprofit to measure. It does involve a bit of economic analysis and does tend to require access to public data at times. Whether you measure SROI really depends on your organization's capacity and preference, as well as what your stakeholders are asking for. If you're curious about SROI, there are a couple of different approaches to this. Cost per participant looks at the cost of each beneficiary who goes through your programming. For example, with only $14, you can provide 2 women with the opportunity to build the necessary network and skills to be employed within 1 year. I'm sure you've all seen something like this before. Keep in mind that this type of measure does not so much reflect how impactful your programming is, but rather it communicates how effective your organization is at distributing funds. Economic SROI calculates how much your programming saved donors and government in public spending. For example, if your programming led to 300 women being employed that were dependent on social benefits, you could calculate how much public spending was saved as a result of your program's contributions. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about SRI, believe me, there's like plenty of resources online that touch in this topic in more depth. So now that we've gone through the types of KPIs, let's jump into the characteristics that each of your KPIs should embody regardless of their type. When it comes to KPI characteristics, I developed something called the summer rules because I know I definitely need a little bit more of summer. So your KPI should be specific in that you make sure they connect to the intended results of your projects and programs. Understandable in that you're defining them in detail. For example, if you claim to provide quality jobs, be able to define quality. Measurable in that you choose KPIs that you'll be able to collect data on and analyze. Actionable in that your KPIs encourage you to pivot and make moves when applicable. Realistic in that you actually have the capacity to measure this KPI. And lastly, relevant in that they reflect what stakeholders you're sharing the results of your programming with. Maybe it's beneficiaries, funders, public, staff, volunteers, etc. All right, so let's just move on to some additional KPI characteristics to keep in mind. And I promise you, once you develop high quality KPIs, the sky's really the limit. So hang in there. All right, make sure to incorporate both leading and lagging KPIs. Leading KPIs are early indications of performance, which communicate progress towards your longer term goals. They support you in catching trends in your data, predicting outcomes, and pivoting when needed. Leading KPIs should be tracked on a shorter term, I'd say weekly or monthly basis. Let's look at the example. Applications converted to interview invitations. This is a leading indicator of the outcome participants employed end of program or 1 year post-program. This is because the more participants who are invited for interviews, the more likely they will be to have job placements. Lagging KPIs are indications of the success of your longer-term goals or outcomes. Lagging indicators are best used in tandem with leading indicators so you can uncover which trends have contributed to your outcomes, and use that to help you build out future strategies for your organization. Lagging KPIs should be tracked more on like a longer term basis, like monthly, quarterly, annually. Let's look at the example of our lagging indicator, participants employed by end of program. If we see that our leading indicator, applicants converted to interview invitations, is leading to participants employed by the end of the program, this tells us that our activities or our leading indicators have contributed to the success of our long-term outcome or lagging indicator. All right, so next we have quantitative versus qualitative KPIs. Quantitative KPIs are data points measured in numbers and statistics. For example, 92% of women attended the application workshop. Qualitative KPIs are non-numerical data points that measure ideas and experiences. For example, the confidence level of women in interviews. As a tip, you can transform qualitative measures into quantitative data. Try rating scales. Like in this case, your survey might ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident did you feel in the interview? Now you have a quantifiable metric. So now that we're familiar with the characteristics of KPIs, I want to introduce you to a KPI tree, which is going to be a great tool to guide you when you start to brainstorm what KPIs you want to use. The purpose of a KPI tree is to really act as a visual aid that helps you break down the components of your logic model into KPIs. So really it's meant to start the brainstorming process, map out where your KPIs fall in relation to your logic model, and allow you to get creative. I'm going to first show you an outline of a KPI tree so you can understand where the different components fall, and then I'll show you an example of a KPI tree in action. I'm going to show you a diagram that I created online for the purpose of presenting, but feel free to use some colorful pens and just jot things down on a piece of paper. That's honestly how I've always done it, and it tends to work really well. All right, so we'll get started with the tree. You'll start with your mission as the top. That's going to be your North Star, what you're reaching for. Then you'll want to list out your programs. You'll want to branch off your programs to specify the specific activities within that program. You'll then want to list out your output KPIs for each of your activities. Think of these as the intended deliverables of this specific activity. So generally, these KPIs should be leading and quantitative. You'll then want to move down into listing out your short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. You'll want to branch off with KPIs that measure the success of those outcomes. Generally, these KPIs are lagging and can be either qualitative or quantitative. All right, so let's take a look at this in action. All right, so we have the mission at the top, gender equality through employment opportunities for women. Then we have the programs. We have skills course and networking conference. For the skills course, we have 2 activities, application workshop and interview workshop. For the networking conference, activities are panel and networking hour. Now let's look at some examples of output KPIs. For the application workshop, we have applications submitted and applications to interview invites. For the interview workshop, we have interview invites and job placements from those interviews. For the panel, we have number of panelists and audience engagement. And for the networking event, we have number of job offers and employers attended. So briefly, just to give you an idea of how these KPIs are helpful. Well, if for the interview workshop, we have a high number of interview invites, but a low number of job placements post-interview, we may need to look and see where our interview workshops are missing the mark. So you can see how your KPIs start to guide those questions and help you take strategic actions. So on to outcomes. Let's say your short-term outcome is participants employed post-program. KPIs might be the number of those who completed the program and number of participants employed 1 year post-program. If your intermediate outcome is increased income due to sustained employment, KPIs might be the percentage of increased income and the number of participants still employed. Lastly, if your long-term outcome is financial independence, KPIs might look at the perception of financial independence and reduced dependency on income. Again, these aren't meant to be too in-depth of examples. I just want to really show you how this works, okay? So once you have an idea of what your KPIs will be, you'll want to build out a KPI profile for each of your KPIs. All right, so KPI profiles. The purpose of a KPI profile is to make sure that you and your team have a clear understanding of what the KPI communicates, what it intends to measure, and where your current measure sits in comparison to your goals. Each KPI profile will generally consist of the following: the name of your KPI, a definition, so that's what it measures and how it's measured, why this KPI matters and what it tells you, whether it's leading or lagging, the time frame or frequency that you'll be tracking this KPI, the goal or benchmark you're aiming for. Note that some KPIs might not have a goal and are just like more informative. So just know that not every KPI needs a goal. It's always only where it's applicable. And the measure, so that's where the data stands currently. So let's take a look at an example. The name is increased income due to sustained employment. What it measures is the percent of participants with increased income 2 years after program. How it's measured is through data collected via stakeholder survey that inquired about income levels. This indicator tells us if participants are sustaining employment and it has contributed to increased household income. This is an intermediate outcome measured 2 years post-program. It's lagging. Our goal is 95%. Our current standing is 87. So once you have a profile for each metric, we're going to want to put them in one place for easy tracking. This is where a KPI dashboard comes in. Let's take a look. All right, so to start, a KPI dashboard is just a database pretty much where you'll store all of your KPI profiles and begin to enter data that you can monitor and analyze over time. So you can start by adding your KPIs profiles into a platform like Google Sheets, for example. Google Sheets is great just because you can update it and you can give your whole team access to it. So it's like a working document. So that's a great platform for it. When creating your dashboard, consider organizing your KPIs by breaking them up into sections based on whether they're outcome versus output focused. You'll see an example of this in a minute. You might also want to consider creating separate sheets for KPIs that require like weekly, monthly, or annual analysis. This way you have like specific dashboards for the various timeframes that you're analyzing. So let me show you an example of a KPI dashboard that has a few examples filled in. And there'll be a copy of this in information that we'll send out. So you have like a template that you can actually copy and paste and start putting in your own KPI profiles. Okay, so let me just show you. All right, so here's an example of a KPI dashboard. You can see that you have your columns up at the top, which are the columns of our profiles, remember? And then each of these are just profiles. You can see how they were sort of just copied and pasted right in there. And they're organized. I have my outcome KPIs. I have my output KPIs. And in this case, I organized them based on the specific like activity. You can see down here too. All right, and then there's a little space for reflection so you can like reflect on your analysis. Now we'll move over. You can see it starts to turn gray. So this is just where you're going to put in your measures. These ones, for example, are measured on a yearly basis. So maybe I'd have May 1st, June 1st, July 1st, and you start entering in those measures. And then these outputs are measured on a monthly basis. So that would be, you know, you can, I'm sorry, this one would be like 2020, 2021. And then this would be like May 1st, June 1st. You see how you kind of get it, right? And then you could go as far as creating new sheets, like towards the bottom for like your monthly ones, if you wanted to separate these out and then just have like one overriding dashboard with all the measures. It's really up to you and how many KPIs you have, right? All right. So now we'll go ahead and look into when to measure impact. All right, so let's take a look at where your logic model and KPI should fall into a project cycle. Oftentimes, nonprofits try to measure their outputs and outcomes at the end of the programming, and to no surprise, they end up really stuck trying to backtrack and collect data on their projects. I've seen this probably countless times. This can make impact reporting really, really difficult and tedious. And oftentimes, nonprofits will end up throwing around sort of like empty impact statements in an attempt to build a compelling report because they haven't tracked along. I've definitely been there. So let's take a look at the project cycle. Stage one is idea generation. When you're developing your project idea, you want to make sure that the project is in line with your outcomes. This will provide direction for your projects. Stage two is project planning. This is when you want to start building out your output KPIs for each project to make sure you're on track. Stage three is about collecting baseline data. Here you'll want to collect data on where your organization currently stands. For example, if one of your project outcomes is to increase employment, you may want to collect current data on like employment rates. This way you can track how your organization has contributed over time to that rate. Stage four, implement and analyze, is when you want to keep an eye on your KPIs to determine what's working and what isn't. This way you can make any necessary changes like throughout the project, realizing you're missing the mark before it's too late, right? Lastly, stage five is reporting. This is when you can report on your deliverables and forecast for the future, all with the support of your KPIs that you've been tracking all along. So really quickly, I just want to zoom back into stage four of the project cycle, implement and analyze. I want to give you a few different methods that are going to help you analyze your KPIs. The first method is volatility analysis. This is where you're going to compare your current measures to the goal you set for this metric, as well as measures for this specific KPI in the previous week, month, quarter, or year, whatever the measuring schedule is. Ask yourself, what changes do we see and why do we think it changed? For example, if you're tracking participation rates and it seems to be much higher in September and October, think about what conditions or actions may have contributed to an increase in attendance. Correlation analysis involves thinking about how your KPIs relate to each other. For example, if your organization is facilitating an interview training workshop, you might want to track the ratio between interview workshop participants and those who were given a job offer. This provides clues into how successful your interview workshop is in converting to job offers. Change over time analysis is where you want to compare your baseline data that we just talked about to your current KPI measures. Are you seeing an increase, decrease, no fluctuation at all? For example, if the number of employed women in, like, let's say a small rural town was 45%, and 1 year after your programming, it's still 45%, you may want to ask yourself why this number has not changed. Have you waited long enough to see the outcome? Maybe you just haven't waited long enough. Are your participants finding and sustaining employment? So keep in mind that the purpose of analysis is not always to point to like a direct relationship between why things are and not why these things are or are not working. It's more meant to just like guide critical thinking and discussion that can lead to hypotheses of why your measures look the way they do, allowing you to make informed decisions and increase the efficiency of your programming. All right, so we'll jump into the next section, impact reporting. As most of you probably know, impact reports are narrative reports that communicate the goals of your programming to your stakeholders, as well as they demonstrate where you started, where you are currently, and where you're headed. While impact reporting can often seem like a pretty daunting task, you'll find it's actually pretty easy once you have your logic model and KPIs ready to go. So who are impact reports for? Well, they're for stakeholders. That's funders, board members, volunteers, you name it. Impact reporting often takes the form of like an annual report, but you can also create impact reports throughout the year. It really depends on what your stakeholders' preferences are. And what do they include? Well, let's take a look. So I'm going to walk you through 10 common components of impact reports. You can choose to include them all, or you can pick and choose what makes the most sense for your organization. Organization overview is where you want to specify which problem you're addressing and your organization's angle in contributing to the solution. Great time to reflect back on your vision and mission. Outcomes is where you'll want to share what your intended outcomes are and how they support your vision and mission. You'll then want to give program summaries and make sure you specify how these programs connect to your outcomes. Activities, pretty straightforward, what activities are involved in your projects. Inputs is where you specify which resources went into your programs. Outputs is where you can specify the immediate deliverables of your projects and how they support your outcomes. This is a great time to throw in a few output KPIs actually into your report to back you up. Impact is where you can talk about what outcomes your organization has contributed to. Another great place for KPIs. Storytelling is the time to highlight some of your beneficiary stories. Reflection is where you can share what you've learned from your programs. You can use KPIs to communicate this as well. You can specify how certain KPI measurements have helped shape the future of your programs. Lastly, forecasting is your ambitions for the coming years, as well as what resources you might need to support that projection. So this can be a great time to add a subtle call to action by saying something along the lines of, with continued support from XYZ, we'll be able to accomplish XYZ. This is another great place to use KPIs to justify what your projects can accomplish if given more resources. In addition to the components above, I just want to share a few extra tips and tricks for impact reporting I picked up along the way. Include data visualization like graphs and charts to communicate your data. Generally, readers tend to absorb information much better with visuals. I know I definitely do. Make sure you're transparent. Don't be afraid to share what you learned. Transparency about where and why you missed the mark will really gain trust with your stakeholders. Keep it personalized by mirroring the report with the passions and interests of your stakeholders. If your audience is staff, put emphasis on how their direct contributions through their roles have impacted your outputs and outcomes. Make sure to storytell. Give your readers a compelling and emotional story that they can relate to. This is a great motivator for those who have invested in your organization, as it gives them a chance to see through the eyes of those who you're supporting, and it really will demonstrate the work that your organization does. All right, so we've come a long way, and we went through creating a logic model, developing KPIs, how and when to measure your KPIs, and impact reporting. So I'm now going to share a case study with you. So this case study reflects an experience I had working for a nonprofit organization in Uganda. It's not the organization I currently work for, SEED. This was another grassroots organization. One of the central goals of the organization was to promote sustained and quality education for young girls. So when I first started with this organization, it really didn't take long to realize that there weren't any measures in place to track impact. So this is when our team really dedicated ourselves to researching how we could create impact measurement tools. So I'm just going to share an example of a project journey with you. It's nearly identical to some of the things we're working on. And this is really just to show you the results you can expect when implementing an impact management strategy. The first thing I want to share with you is the scope of the project through a logic model. The mission at the top was to promote sustained and quality education for young girls in Gulu, Uganda. The project was reproductive health workshops. So you might ask, why are you focused on reproductive health workshops when your goal is to promote sustained and quality education? Well, our preliminary research informed us that challenges with management of the menstrual cycle was one of the main reasons that the attendance rate, the school attendance rate of young girls was low. So this really highlights the importance of building out projects based on research. Our activities were workshop on management of the menstrual cycle and distribution of reusable pads and a workshop on how to use them. Our inputs were workshop space, facilitators, workshop materials, volunteers, things like that. Our outputs were 1, to provide quality education to 200 young girls on how to manage the menstrual cycle, so they're more confident in going to school, and 2, provide 200 reusable pads for girls. The short-term outcomes were, the outcomes were young girls adopting and wearing reusable pads and increased confidence to go to school during the menstrual cycle. Intermediate outcome was increased school attendance rate, and long-term outcomes was educated young girls prepared for continued education. All right, so now let's take a look at some of the KPIs tracked throughout the project and how they inform decisions about the direction of the project. All right, year one. Our KPIs told us that we exceeded our goal in workshop attendance. Our goal was 200 and we had 235. You can see the difference between our goal and measure highlighted in green in the difference column. We had the same success with pads distributed. The goal was 200, we distributed 215. But the school's attendance rate was still way below our goal. It sat at 11% and we were hoping for a 30% increase. So we had to ask ourselves, if the attendance to the workshop was high and pads were distributed, why wasn't the school attendance rate increasing? In response, we conducted a stakeholder survey amongst the young girls. We found 70% were still avoiding school because there was nowhere to cleanse their reusable pads throughout the day. And 40% reported male stigma towards girls on their menstrual cycle at school. So what did we do? We found funding to improve bathroom facilities and hosted a workshop for boys to try and address these barriers. Let's take a look at what happened in year two. The workshop for boys had a way lower turnout rate than expected. They really didn't want to attend the workshop. But we did meet our goal of improved bathroom facilities and school attendance, so that went way up. So what do these KPIs tell us? Well, they tell us that sanitary and private bathroom facilities are a significant reason girls weren't attending school during their menstrual cycle, and that we definitely need better ways to engage boys to reduce stigma. So as you can see, by tracking our outputs and shorter term outcomes along the way, we were able to pivot throughout the project by noticing trends and taking strategic actionable steps to improve our programming. Let's take a look at how much of a difference having tracked these KPIs makes when impact reporting. Okay, so this is what impact reporting looks like without KPIs. Our organization hosted a workshop for 200 plus young girls on female hygiene and reproductive health, handed out over 200 reusable pads. It's a one-liner that I really see far too often in the sector, and it's a shame because it really fails to demonstrate the impact organizations have worked so hard to accomplish. So let's take a look at impact reporting with KPIs. Our organization hosted a workshop for 200 plus young girls on female hygiene and reproductive health and handed out over 200 reusable pads. Upon reflection, we noticed school attendance was not increasing significantly. We only saw 11% increase versus the 37% increase we aimed for. This is good transparency, right? A stakeholder survey amongst young women informed us that 70% still did not want to go to school because they didn't have safe facilities and 40% because there was peer stigma. We improved 3 bathroom facilities and hosted workshops for 50 boy students. While bathroom facilities increased school attendance by 37%, we did still have trouble engaging boy students. We only had a 15% turnout rate versus our goal of 90. Next year, we'll be working on more creative ways to engage the boy students based on survey data. We aim to host an event with an 85% attendance rate. So after looking at these 2 examples, if you were a donor, beneficiary, staff member, community member, which organization would you be more likely to support and promote? Likely the second, right? This is because it communicates transparency, problem solving, efficiency, all while telling a story. So what are our takeaways from today? You need to know what impact you're trying to have before developing impact KPIs. This is where a logic model is really helpful. Your KPIs should communicate progress or lack thereof towards your short and long-term goals. This is where measurement and analysis come in. You should use analysis to take action. Pivoting is important. Impact management is worth the investment. Once you build out your logic model on KPIs, the intimidating part is over. To avoid feeling overwhelmed, just feel free to start out with a few KPIs, just get the hang of it. Lastly, don't be afraid of results, but do be afraid of not doing anything with these results. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll head into Q&A.
Amazing, Maggie. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. And I know a lot of people on our webinar today are probably taking frantic notes. We did have a bunch of questions come in, so I will jump straight into it, just I'm conscious of time. So the first one is, what if we are just starting to track impact now? Can we go backwards and track our past impact?
So that's a great question and a common question. So going backwards to track impact, it's a bit tricky. This is mainly because tracking impact, such as like intermediate and long-term outcomes, does require that you start with baseline data, like what the conditions were before your programming, and then track progress over time. That data you can't really get unless it was tracked, if you know what I mean. But what you may be able to do is trace back your outputs, since they are more of like numerical measurements, like number of participants, for example. You may have some of this data on record. So this would at least like support you in comparing historical outputs to your current outputs to help you like notice trends. Like let's say 2 years ago, you had 30% less participants. Well, you can think about what your organization did to increase the participants over the last 2 years. So while reflecting back on your outputs, it can help you with strategy moving forward. It might not so much reflect your impact, if you know what I mean. So your best bet is really just to get started on tracking data and moving forward from there.
Great advice, thank you. And I see in our chat, we've had a lot of compliments come in as well. So from Lizzie, it says that was fantastic. One of the best webinars I've ever been on. Thank you. Carolyn says excellent presentation. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam.
We've got a question from Susanna coming in. So how would you design higher level outcome KPIs for a 5-year strategic plan?
Higher level outcome KPIs for a 5-year strategic plan. I would say the same way, or output or outcome. Sorry, Sam.
Outcome.
Yeah, outcome. So I would do it the same way. It's really taking a look at like what your mission is, and then creating some more long-term outcomes. Your outcomes would reflect, like your long-term outcomes would reflect about a 5-year period. So think about 5 years from now, what would you like to see happen? And just remember that these are supposed to be outcomes that your organization is contributing to through their programs. These are not outcomes that are directly a result of your programming.
Perfect, thank you. And I guess kind of building on that. So how would you collect data where it's scarce or not available at all? So for example, developing context. How do we make sure we have the quality data that we need?
So that's a great question. I've worked in a lot of these contexts myself, so I do understand that difficulty. I would suggest looking for like master's projects, smaller scale research projects. You can see if there's any local government data or research from other NGOs in the area, things like that. Otherwise, if the scope of your project is small enough, you may want to go ahead and collect data yourself. In terms of quality, if you are collecting that data yourself, you'll have a lot more control over the quality of the data. But if you're collecting secondary data, just make sure you do your research like on the research, if you know what I mean. Like you may want to look into what the purpose of the research was, the credentials of who collected it, who the intended audience was, and obviously when it was published to make sure it's still relevant. But I would even suggest Googling like tips for collecting primary or secondary data, and there's more resources you can imagine on that. So.
Amazing. So I think we've got time for one more question before we round it out. So what should we do if we don't have the financial resources for impact management?
That's another really common question. I would say reach out to your funders. So if you develop like an outline of your impact management strategy and you really communicate the importance and the expected results of this type of strategy to donors, you really might be surprised at like how much they're willing to help. I don't know, let's say you were a donor and you were donating to a project, but if the organization was like, hey, if you support us with like $1,000 for impact management, we can make this project even more effective and really increase our long-term impact, you know, so on and so forth. Obviously in a more strategic and formal way than that, but you understand the point. You'd be surprised how much they're willing to help, by the way. I'd also recommend including impact management in your budget, the same way you would include like financial audits in your budget. If we can start looking at impact audits is just as important as financial audits, then we can really start prioritizing impact management.
Great, thanks so much, Maggie. And that is our time for today. So that concludes our session. Maggie, thank you again for sharing your expertise and helping all of our friends here today learn to effectively manage how successful their programs and initiatives are.